Get out! You're fired! Maggie's hands trembled as she untied her apron. 40 years, gone in seconds, all because she showed kindness. The homeless man she fed, he sat frozen, guilt written all over his face. Mr. Reynolds, the cruel diner owner, sneered. "We run a business, not a charity." Maggie walked out, jobless, humiliated, but not broken. She had no idea the same man she helped would change her life forever. And the next day, that diner would never be the same again. Maggie Carter had worked at Sonny's Diner for as long as she could remember. At 60 years old, her hands bore the scars of a life spent carrying trays, pouring coffee, and listening to the stories of strangers. She knew every regular customer by name. She knew their orders, their troubles, and their joys. The diner wasn't just her job. It was her home. That morning, the icy wind rattled the windows as Maggie wiped down the counter. Another ordinary day, until the door creaked open. A man stepped inside. His clothes were tattered, his shoes worn down to the soles. A heavy coat, years past its prime, hung loosely around his shoulders. His face was unshaven, his eyes weary. Maggie immediately recognized the look. Hunger. Exhaustion. The kind that gnawed at a person's bones. The other waitresses turned away. Customers stared, their lips curling in quiet judgment. A couple at a nearby booth whispered, "Maggie?" She just saw a man in need. She picked up a steaming cup of coffee, walked to the man, and set it down in front of him. "Coffee's fresh," she said, motioning to the counter. "Come warm up." The man hesitated. His fingers trembled as he wrapped them around the cup. He looked up, eyes glassy with shock and gratitude. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, voice rough but quiet. Maggie smiled kindly. "Because everyone deserves a little kindness." Before he could respond, a sharp voice cut through the diner. "Maggie!" The warm moment shattered. Mr. Reynolds, the diner's owner, stormed out from the back. His face was red, his fists clenched. "What do you think you're doing?" he snapped. Maggie stood firm. "Giving him a hot meal." Reynolds's lip curled in disgust. "We run a business, not a charity. This is coming out of your paycheck." Maggie's stomach dropped, but she held her ground. "Then take it from me," she said, voice steady. Reynolds laughed coldly. "No need. You're fired." Silence fell over the diner. A waitress gasped. A few customers shifted uncomfortably. Maggie felt like she had been punched in the gut. The homeless man stiffened, guilt written all over his face. Maggie swallowed hard, blinking back the sting in her eyes. Slowly, she untied her apron, folded it, and placed it on the counter. 40 years. Gone. Without another word, she turned and walked out into the cold. As the door slammed behind her, the diner buzzed with whispers. The homeless man watched her go, his jaw clenched. Maggie thought her life had just fallen apart. She had no idea. Tomorrow would change everything. Maggie Carter pulled her coat tighter around herself as she stepped out of the diner. The cold wind bit through the thin fabric, but it was nothing compared to the emptiness in her chest. 40 years. She had given 4 decades of her life to that place. She had never missed a shift, never complained, even when her feet ached so badly she could barely stand. She had watched customers grow up, get married, have kids, and now, she was nothing to them. Her hands trembled as she stuffed them into her pockets and started the long walk home. She could feel the tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not cry. She had rent due at the end of the month. She had a fridge that was already looking too empty. She was 60 years old. Who was going to hire a woman her age? A deep sigh escaped her lips. But then, she thought about the man. She pictured the way his hands shook when she handed him that coffee. The way his eyes had softened, just for a moment, as if someone had reminded him that he was still human. She had seen too many people look right through him like he did not exist. But she had seen him, and she did not regret it. Maggie reached her small apartment and unlocked the door. The place was modest, but clean. Her late husband had built the kitchen cabinets himself. She ran her fingers along the worn wooden surface, sighing. What am I going to do? She whispered to herself. The answer? She did not know. She heated up a small bowl of soup, but her stomach was too twisted to eat much. She sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker. Mr. Reynolds's words echoed in her head. We run a business, not a charity. Maggie shook her head. Then what kind of business do you want to run? She may have lost her job, but she would never lose her values. Helping that man was the right thing to do. And if the world punished people for being kind, then so be it. She curled up under her blanket, staring at the ceiling. Maybe tomorrow she would figure something out. Maybe she would not. But as she closed her eyes, one thought stayed firm in her mind. Kindness is never wasted. And she would never stop believing that. The sound of knocking pulled Maggie from her restless sleep. She blinked groggily, the weight of yesterday's nightmare still pressing down on her chest. Maybe it was the landlord. Maybe a neighbor. She shuffled toward the door, her heart heavy with the realization that she had nowhere to be today. For the first time in 40 years, she had no job to go to. Maggie took a slow breath and opened the door. She froze. Standing before her was the same man from the diner, but he was different. The scruffy beard was gone. The ragged clothes replaced with a crisp, expensive suit. His shoes shined like they had never touched a sidewalk in their life. He looked like he belonged in a boardroom, not on the streets. Maggie's fingers tightened around the doorknob. I do not understand, she stammered. The man smiled, a warm, knowing smile. I am sorry for the surprise, he said, his voice smooth and confident. But I figured I owed you an explanation. Maggie could not speak. Her mind was racing. Was this a trick? A setup? She glanced past him, half expecting the diner owner, Mr. Reynolds, to jump out and yell that this was all some cruel joke. But there was no one else. Just this man who was not supposed to be standing in front of her like this. Her lips parted, confusion laced in her voice. Who are you? The man gave a small chuckle. My name is Daniel Harper. He extended a hand, but Maggie was too stunned to take it. She just stared. Yesterday, she had watched this man sip coffee with shaking hands. Yesterday, she had seen exhaustion, hunger, and hopelessness in his eyes. And today, he stood before her like he owned the world. Daniel Harper's eyes softened. I am not homeless, Maggie, he admitted, but I have been before. Maggie's breath hitched. What is happening? Daniel's smile turned serious. Yesterday I was testing something, looking for something. He exhaled deeply. And I found it. I found you. Maggie's heartbeat pounded in her ears. Testing? Found her? She did not understand. But before she could ask another question, Daniel gave her a look filled with determination. I need your help, Maggie. Her fingers trembled. The world she thought she knew had just flipped upside down. Maggie stared, speechless. Daniel Harper? That name sounded familiar. But she could not place it. She gripped the doorframe, feeling as if her world was suddenly spinning too fast. I do not understand, she finally whispered. Daniel gave her a patient smile, stepping forward just enough to lower his voice. Maggie, I am not who you think I am. Her heart skipped a beat. Yesterday, when I walked into that diner, I was not looking for food. I was looking for answers. Maggie's lips parted, confusion tightening her chest. Daniel folded his hands in front of him, his expression earnest. Years ago, I lost everything. His voice was steady, but there was a weight behind it. My business collapsed. My home was taken. I was left with nothing but the kindness of strangers. Maggie felt a pang in her chest. She had seen that look before, the look of someone who had seen rock bottom. And because of that, Daniel continued, I made a promise to myself. If I ever got back on my feet, I would find people like me, the ones who gave when they had nothing to gain, The ones who treated others with dignity, no matter what. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. Was he saying? Daniel's eyes softened. Yesterday, you passed that test, Maggie. The diner. He shook his head. It failed. A chill ran through her. You were testing us? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. Daniel nodded. I do this often. I walk into businesses, dressed like someone society ignores. I see how I am treated. And you? He let out a breath. You are exactly the kind of person the world needs more of. Maggie felt tears sting her eyes. All these years, she had given without expecting anything in return. Had kindness finally come back to her? Daniel reached into his pocket, pulling out a thick envelope. He extended it toward her. I want to reward good people like you. Maggie's hands trembled as she took it. What is this? She asked cautiously. Daniel smiled. A second chance. Maggie slowly peeled open the envelope and gasped. Inside was a check large enough to pay her bills, a check large enough to retire, a check large enough to change her life. Her legs felt weak. Daniel reached out, steadying her. Kindness is not just about helping others, Maggie, he said gently. It is about making sure the right people never struggle again. Maggie's fingers shook as she pulled the check from the envelope. Her breath hitched. This was not just enough to cover her bills. This was enough to retire, enough to never worry about money again. She pressed a hand to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Daniel watched her patiently, giving her time to process. Maggie had never held this much money in her life. She looked up, voice breaking. I cannot accept this. Daniel's brow lifted. Why not? Maggie let out a shaky laugh. Because I do not deserve this. Daniel folded his arms, studying her. You worked at that diner for 40 years. You treated strangers like family. You gave without hesitation, even when it cost you everything. And you think you do not deserve this? Maggie swallowed hard. Daniel leaned forward, his voice calm, steady, firm. Maggie, this is not charity. This is recognition. A tear slipped down her cheek. She had spent her whole life helping others. And now, someone was helping her. Maggie exhaled, gripping the check. I do not know what to say. Daniel's lips curved into a smile. Then do not say anything just yet, because this is only the beginning. Maggie blinked. What do you mean? Daniel leaned back in his chair. I do not just want to help you. I want you to help me. Maggie frowned, confused. Help you? With what? Daniel's gaze was unwavering. I want to start a foundation. A place for people who have hit rock bottom, who just need a little kindness to get back on their feet. Maggie's heart skipped a beat. Daniel smiled. And I want you to help me run it. Maggie's hands tightened around the check. Me? She whispered. Daniel nodded. You know what it is like to struggle. You know what it means to be overlooked. You have been changing lives for decades, Maggie. I just want to give you the platform to do it on a bigger scale. Maggie let out a slow breath. Could she really do this? She had spent her life serving meals, offering kindness in small ways. Now, Daniel was offering her the chance to change lives forever. Her voice was barely a whisper. Why me? Daniel's smile softened. Because the world needs more people like you. Maggie stood in front of the large glass building, her heart pounding. Sunny Hearts Foundation. The name shone proudly on the entrance, the golden letters gleaming in the sunlight. She swallowed hard. This was her new home. Not a diner. Not a place to serve coffee. A place to serve hope. Daniel stood beside her, smiling. Welcome to your new life, Maggie. She chuckled, still in disbelief. I spent 40 years wiping down tables. I never thought I would be here. Daniel's voice was warm. Neither did I. But the world needed someone like you. And now, here you are. Maggie stepped inside, her breath catching. Volunteers bustled through the halls. The smell of freshly cooked meals filled the air. A line of people stretched to the door. People in need of help. Some were homeless, searching for shelter. Some were single parents, struggling to provide. Some were just like Daniel once was, desperate for a second chance. Maggie's chest tightened. She had spent her life serving food. Now, she was serving something even greater. Hope, dignity, a future. She rolled up her sleeves. "All right, where do we start?" A young woman approached, holding a clipboard. "Miss Maggie, we have a mother of 3 who just lost her home. She needs help immediately." Maggie's heart ached. She nodded. "Let's find her a place to stay." The woman smiled. "Right this way." Maggie followed, her hands steady, her heart full. This was her purpose. Not a job, not a paycheck, a calling. Daniel watched her from across the room, his arms crossed. He had always believed in kindness. But Maggie? She had just proven that kindness could change the world. Maggie helped serve meals, arranged shelters, and gave people the resources they needed to rebuild their lives. And with every family she helped, every struggling soul she lifted up, she realized something. Losing her job at the diner? It was the best thing that ever happened to her. Sonny's diner was not the same anymore. For decades, it had been a place of warmth. Customers had come not just for the food, but for the feeling of home. And that feeling? It left the day Maggie was fired. Now, the once bustling diner sat eerily quiet. Half the tables were empty. The usual morning rush? Gone. Mr. Reynolds stood behind the counter, gripping a coffee pot, his eyes scanning the restaurant. 2 booths occupied, a couple at the counter, a man reading a newspaper alone. That was it. Not long ago, people waited in lines out the door for a seat at Sonny's. Not anymore. "Where the hell is everyone?" he muttered, rubbing his temples. The new waitress, a nervous young woman barely in her 20s, hesitated. "They, said they are going somewhere else," she admitted. Mr. Reynolds frowned. "Where?" She hesitated before whispering. "Maggie's Foundation. They serve meals for people in need." The words hit him like a slap. His grip on the coffee pot tightened. "They are eating for free?" "So what? This is a business." The waitress flinched at his sharp tone. I do not think it is just about the food," she mumbled. Mr. Reynolds glared at her. And deep down, he knew she was right. This was not about the food. This was about Maggie. Meanwhile, across town, Maggie's world had changed forever. Sunny Hearts Foundation was thriving. What started as a simple idea had now become a movement. Every day more volunteers showed up to help. Every day more people came through the doors for food, support, and warmth. And every day Maggie woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. Daniel Harper stood beside her, watching with pride. "You did this," he told her. Maggie laughed softly. "No, Daniel, we did this." But the truth was, Maggie was now a symbol, a reminder that kindness always comes back. And the world was starting to notice. One evening, Mr. Reynolds sat at the diner's counter, flipping through channels on the small TV. His mood had been foul all day. Customers were still disappearing. His best employees had left. His new staff? Clueless, slow, nothing like Maggie. He took a long sip of coffee, rubbing his temples. Then, he froze. Maggie's face filled the screen. A news anchor's voice rang out. "Sunny Hearts Foundation has provided over 5,000 meals and counting, helping struggling families get back on their feet. It all started with one woman, Maggie Carter." The screen cut to Maggie, standing in a busy dining hall, smiling as she served a plate to a young mother and her child. "Kindness costs nothing," Maggie said, "but it changes everything." Mr. Reynolds' stomach twisted. He had mocked her kindness, and now the entire world was celebrating it. A reporter appeared, standing outside the foundation. "People from all over the city are donating to support Maggie Carter's vision." The same woman who was fired from Sonny's diner for showing kindness to a stranger is now leading one of the most successful charity programs in the state. The screen flashed to Maggie standing beside Daniel Harper. Mr. Reynolds gasped. He recognized that man. The homeless man. The one he kicked out. But he was not homeless. He was a millionaire, a philanthropist, and he was supporting Maggie. Mr. Reynolds gripped the counter. His throat went dry. This cannot be happening. Then, the camera zoomed in as the reporter asked Maggie, "If you could say anything to your former boss, what would it be?" Maggie's smile never wavered. "Thank you." The reporter blinked. "Thank you? Why?" Maggie let out a small laugh. "Because firing me was the best thing that ever happened to me." The news segment ended. Mr. Reynolds slowly turned off the TV. His hands were shaking. The realization hit him harder than he could bear. He had fired a woman who built his diner. And now, she was thriving. And he was just an old man sitting in an empty restaurant. Maggie stood at the entrance of Sunny Hearts Foundation, watching as people lined up outside. A year ago, she had been standing behind the counter of a diner, pouring coffee, wiping tables, living a life of routine. Now, she was standing in her own office. Her heart swelled as she looked around the large community center, buzzing with activity. Volunteers moved quickly, preparing meals, organizing supplies, and helping families find shelter. Smiling children ran through the halls, their laughter filling the air. Women and men, once struggling to find hope, now sat with counselors, discussing job opportunities. The warm scent of fresh bread filled the space, a reminder that no one who walked through these doors would ever go hungry again. Maggie blinked back tears. This place existed because of one simple act of kindness. She had offered a homeless man a cup of coffee, and that decision had changed her life forever. "This was always your purpose." A familiar voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Maggie," Daniel Harper said, stepping beside her. He patted her shoulder, his eyes filled with pride. "You see all this?" He gestured to the long line of people waiting outside. "This was always your purpose." Maggie exhaled, shaking her head in disbelief. "It does not feel real," she whispered. "It feels like a dream." Daniel smiled. "That is because you spent 40 years believing you were just a waitress. But Maggie, you were never just a waitress." Maggie bit her lip, looking around at the people, her people. She had spent so much of her life serving food to customers who barely noticed her. And now? People looked at her with gratitude, with respect. She was no longer invisible. She was a leader. She was a force of change. It started with a cup of coffee. An elderly man slowly walked through the front doors, leaning on his cane. Maggie turned and immediately recognized him. "Harold!" she gasped, hurrying over. The old man smiled, his eyes filled with emotion. "Maggie, my dear." Maggie wrapped her arms around him in a warm embrace. "How did you find me?" she asked. Harold chuckled. "How could I not? Your story is everywhere. You are famous now." She laughed softly. "Famous? No, Harold. Just doing what I can." Harold shook his head. "No, Maggie. You are doing more than that. You saved lives." Tears welled in Maggie's eyes. Harold gripped her hand. "Do you remember what you told me years ago?" Maggie nodded, smiling. "Kindness is never wasted." Harold beamed. "And look at you now. You proved it." Maggie turned to Daniel, who was watching with a knowing smile. "It all started with a cup of coffee," she whispered. Daniel nodded. "And it turned into a movement." That night, after all the meals had been served and the families were settled, Maggie sat in her office, looking out the window. She had lost her job at the diner. She had walked home that day, thinking her life was over. But in reality, it had just begun. The knock at her door, the moment Daniel had revealed who he was, the check that changed everything, it all led here. A single act of kindness had changed her life, and thousands of others. Maggie took a deep breath. feeling the weight of it all. The pain, the struggle, the purpose. She was not just a waitress. She was a light in the world. And now, that light was shining brighter than ever.